CIA Director Michael Hayden has done his final interview before leaving his post in the Bush administration. Asked about a federal court ruling that okayed congressional action on warrantless wiretapping, the great and good General Hayden replied, and I quote, "My reaction? Duh." End quote. Anytime we hear a grown man say, duh, in Washington, it's time for the Rachel Maddow Show Lame Duck Watch, because somebody's got to do it. President Ronald Reagan signed the UN Convention Against Torture on April 17, 1988. In 1994, we ratified that treaty, our government. We signed ourselves up for an obligation. We said, we, the United States of America, do officially declare that from here on out, we stand with 145 other countries in the world in saying, to torture. By signing up to that treaty, we agreed that torture would be illegal in our country. We agreed that there would be no exceptions made for torturers ever, that they would always be taken into custody if they dared set foot on our soil. And we agreed that anyone alleged to have tortured or to have gone along with it, to have been complicit in it, would have their case submitted to competent authorities for prosecution. That agreement, that treaty, is why it matters when Susan Crawford, the person responsible for convening the military commissions at Guantanamo, just stopped mincing words. She abandoned the euphemisms, and she told Bob Woodward at the Washington Post that, yeah, what we've been doing is torture. We've been torturing people. She used the T word. That treaty is, again, why it matters. Once you use the T word and you stop saying that what we did wasn't really torture, even though everybody knows it was, once you actually admit that it was torture, our treaty obligations around torture kick in. Thanks to Susan Crawford's interview in the Washington Post, our government just lost the option of not prosecuting American officials for committing torture. At least that's how I read it. In the New York Times yesterday, though, there is a remarkable assertion. The Susan Crawford interview with Bob Woodward, where she said, yeah, it was torture, that interview, the first interview she has done since she was appointed to this military job a couple of years ago, may have been part of a Bush administration strategy. Quoting from the New York Times, in a series of moves this week, including Ms. Crawford's interview published Wednesday by the Washington Post, Bush administration officials seem to be making a public case that closing the Guantanamo Center would be perilous. In other words, according to the New York Times, Ms. Crawford did not go rogue. She did not go off the reservation when she admitted that we tortured people. Rather, that interview was supposed to make the case that Guantanamo shouldn't be closed, that dangerous people who have been abused there, who've been tortured there and can't be prosecuted because of that abuse, they still can't be let out. Yesterday, outgoing CIA Director Mike Hayden did not refute Crawford's torture admission. Instead, he backed her up. He said, quote, "These techniques worked. Do not allow others to say it didn't work. It worked." Want more from the Bush-Cheney Keep Guantanamo Open tour? Well, the Pentagon released a report this week claiming that 61 former Guantanamo prisoners had, quote, returned to the fight. But Seton Hall Law School's Center for Policy and Research carefully analyzed the actual data of previous announcements about this strange statistic. Take a look at this graph that they just published. Kind of looks like an EKG, doesn't it? The graph charts the government's evolving claims about the number of released Guantanamo prisoners that they say went back to their terror-waging ways after leaving Guantanamo. In other words, the Bush administration is willing to concede that they torture prisoners because in their mind it works and they are under no fear of prosecution for that. And because the detainees cannot be prosecuted because they were tortured, they can't be let out because then obviously they all go back to terrorism. It is an argument that is complete, if not cogent. Joining us now is Professor Mark Denbeaux, who is the director of the Seton Hall Law School Center for Policy and Research. He also represents two Tunisian men who are now being held at the Guantanamo Bay prison. Professor Denbeaux, thank you for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Your research found that despite what the government says, few men who have been held at Guantanamo can be said to have gone back to the battlefield. Can you describe your hypothesis and what you found?
Sure. Our model is simply to look at what the government's reports show and analyze them. The government has given its 43rd attempt to describe the number of people who have left Guantanamo and returned to the battlefield. 41 times they've done it orally, as they have this last time, and their numbers have changed from 20 to 12 to 7 to more than 5 to 2 to a couple to a few, 25, 29, 12 to 24. Every time the number has been different. In fact, every time they give a number, they don't identify a date, a place, a time, a name, or an incident to support their claim.
What does to return to the battlefield mean, even?
Well, it turns out they did produce 2 documents by accident. Mayor Daley, the former Mayor Daley, once said, "Never write a letter, never throw one away." Well, the government actually wrote 2 documents. One was a press release published on non-DOD letterhead on their website that identified what they said were 30 people who'd returned to the battlefield. That was in July of '07. That list of 30 identified 15 people. 8 of those people were divided up into 2 groups. 3 of them were from England. They were called the Tipton Three, and they were there because they did a documentary called The Road to Guantanamo.
Wait. Returning to the battlefield means you were in a documentary?
Yes,
okay.
That's included. 5 more of that group actually are identified as the Uyghurs. Now, the Uyghurs are the Chinese Muslims, and they were being held in an Albanian village after leaving Guantanamo, and they were listed as returning to the battlefield because their lawyer wrote an editorial criticizing Guantanamo detention policies. That's 8 of the 15 people they identified. They gave 7 more names, 2 of whom were never in Guantanamo. So they're down to 5 names, and of those names, 2 were Russians who were arrested in Russia but not prosecuted, and 2 were Moroccans. So in fact, there's the number of people who would meet anybody's definition of returning to a battlefield is tiny, and the numbers they've given are simply incoherent.
When you have been studying these 43 different utterances, these seemingly random declarations of the number of people who have returned to the battlefield, contextually, when you look at them, can you tell why the government is making those utterances, why they're making the case that there are people, any number of people who have returned to the battlefield? What's the context?
Well, the only context that we can find out is this one press release, which the DOD put on its website, and after we wrote a report, removed it, so it's no longer available. We have it because law students are smart and know the technology to find it. The only other document that you can identify that gives the name or identification of anybody who returned to the battlefield is a list of 12 names provided by Congressman Rohrabacher to me during a hearing, and DOD demanded that they give it back, and we didn't, because that listed 12 people they said returned to the battlefield. Of those 12, 5 of them returned to the battlefield in the sense that 2 of them went back to Morocco and were arrested. That made them returning to the battlefield. 1 went back to Turkey and was arrested, and 2 went back to Russia and were arrested, tried, and acquitted, and then finally convicted. So to get to the 12 they have there, they have to account people who were, in fact, only arrested in their home country.
So, in other words, we are forgiven from saying, what do you mean the next time we hear them say X number of detainees have returned to the fight? Thank you for having asked that question and done this research on it. It's really, really useful. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Mark Denbeaux is the director of the Seton Hall Law School Center for Policy and Research.